Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and I am joined again by Tim Matthews. Today we're discussing Stephen King's novel, The Dark Half, and this is one of those novels that I think took me by surprise a little. I didn't know what to expect going into it, and by the end of it, I was like, you know what? That was pretty interesting. What were your initial thoughts on this, Tim?
Mine were very similar. So I knew very little about the book, but I knew some because my friend had I think he had read the book and then he had watched the movie because the movie was on Hulu, and so he texted me.
Okay.
He's like, you should check out this Stephen King movie. And he was like midway through it when he was texting me, and he's like, this is pretty solid. It's kind of like a almost got like a bit of a slasher feel to it. And then when it finished, he was like, it was really good. I was kind of let down by the ending, but it was really good. You should check it out. And he and I have talked about it more since now that I've read the book. And I guess the movie has a pretty loyal adaptation of the book, but he just wasn't sure about how that necessarily adapts to screen. And reading the book, I can now understand that because it's a very like in the head type thing. But I really enjoyed the book. It's funny because when I think about the basic plot, it sounds really silly. Like if I were to describe it to someone, I almost feel like I couldn't sell it, that it might sound stupid. But reading it, I was like fully immersed in it. And I was like, yeah, I buy this. I buy this twist. Like this is so I really enjoyed it, and it being a bit more of the streamlined side of Stephen King, it was a pretty easy read. Once it as usual, Stephen King, once it gets going.
Yeah, initially for me, it sort of felt something like a Mission Impossible twist where he's wearing someone else's face.
Yeah.
And, because when they make the comment about the fingerprints showing up, about the main character, Thad Beaumont's fingerprints showing up at these crime scenes, you have this moment where you're like, okay, but he clearly has an alibi.
Mm-hmm.
So was someone, taking his fingerprints and creating, fingerprints way before, that tech was sort of available?
Yeah, that was my initial thought too.
Yeah, I was just like, there's something a little spy espionage like about
Yeah,
that part of it.
I was picturing like the like false like fingerprints, like they'd put it on the tips of their fingers, and then they
Yeah,
would just like and
exactly.
like the picture in my head was probably sillier than it should be, but it was just
Right.
kind of like this person just like going around the crime scene and just like touching a bunch of things like with fake fingerprints. Just like, all right, crime's done. All right, now let's just fingerprint. But clearly that
Yeah.
wasn't how it went.
Right. But eventually I was just so engrossed in the story. I was like, I have to know how this ends. And a lot
Yeah.
of that, I think, has to do with how much the characters in this book just connect to the rest of the Stephen King world. Because you have Thad and his wife, Elizabeth, who live in Ludlow, which is a town we recognize from Pet Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And you have Alan Pangborn, who is the sheriff from Castle Rock. And Castle Rock is obviously one of the towns that is used a ton in Stephen King novels. It's in
Once or
Cujo.
twice. Yeah.
It's yeah, just once or twice. And that character was brought back for the Hulu show Castle Rock. So to have this look at a younger version of the character, because I had already watched Castle Rock before, I was
Mm-hmm.
like, you know what? This is pretty cool getting a lot of this particular character in this book, because going into this, I had no idea what to expect. And given that I had just read the Tommyknockers, I was like, okay, that was weird, but it was a Stephen King thing, definitely.
Yeah.
So I kind of went into this like, all right, you know what? Clearly, The Tommyknockers was not my favorite Stephen King book by a long shot.
I hear that a
So
lot. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's one of the books that even he is like, oh, what did I do? So
Yeah. Yet they're doing another adaptation of it.
yes, they are.
So we'll see.
Possibly.
Maybe.
We'll see if it actually happens.
Yeah, I think James Wan's but at least producing it, so maybe he's got an idea to fix it.
Yeah. So going into this, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to keep an open mind because I had
Mm-hmm.
no clue what to expect. I only ever recognized the book cover because Fright Rags sells a shirt of the book cover that I have, which is the two sparrows, kind of like
Yeah.
upside down and touching beaks
I've seen that
sort
shirt.
of
It's
thing.
so cool.
Yeah, one's right side up and one's upside down and they're touching
Yeah.
beaks and then their eyes look like human eyes kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Now the
It's
shirt makes a
actually
lot
a
more sense.
yeah, it's actually a pretty cool cover when you think about it
Yeah.
within the context of having read the book. But just the characters alone, I was so interested in. I was like, okay, let's see, what was Alan Pangborn really like when he was a cop? Because you don't get too much of that in the Castle Rock show. You get these flashbacks, but it's more about this relationship that he had been fostering instead of his time as a cop. So to get this, I was like, okay, I understand this character even more now. And Thad and Elizabeth were characters who definitely felt like Stephen King characters in the sense that he likes to get meta about authors and writing,
Oh yeah.
because in the Tommyknockers you have two authors in that. One writes westerns, one's a poet. In this, Thad is a writer and he has this pen name, George Stark, that he writes under. So with him, it was definitely like, oh, okay, I see a lot of Stephen King in this,
Mm-hmm.
at least in that. I wasn't even really correlating Richard Bachman with George Stark because George Stark was so wildly different and completely drastic as a character.
Oh yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, it's the characters were really easy to latch onto in this one. They felt natural, they felt real, and like you said with Pangborn, like I really enjoyed the Castle Rock show. I didn't love how it necessarily ended, but I was enjoying like just the time in the show. And Pangborn was one of the most interesting characters. And while reading this and being, I didn't realize it probably till like halfway through the book that I'm just like kind of like that name just sounds familiar, and I'm just thinking, I'm like, is it just because of Stephen King? Is it just a character that, he's popped into another book, at some point? Have I heard it, or just in pop culture? And then finally, like it clicked, and then I started thinking about the older version of the character in the show, and it made me, even though I already liked him a lot on the show, it made me appreciate that character even more because it felt like they paid a lot of really great attention to who that character was in the books and had adapted like an older version of him really well. And so reading it, I'm like, oh yeah, this kind of all makes sense to how he might be as an older man, like the stuff that he already experienced and went through. And I really, really loved his relationship with Thad, that when he first shows up, like it's very much like, I'm here to arrest you. I'm not going to shake your hand or anything. And then Thad, kind of backs up his story a bit. And so when Alan comes back and he's like, I still don't know what to think about this, but I know there's something weird about it, and let's sit down and have a beer, and let's try and figure this out together. And so that the way that their relationship kind of developed, where I feel like Pangborn began to trust him more, but also he definitely still like kept like his distance because there was still something weird about it. He's like, I trust you, but I can't fully trust you because still not everything's adding up. And it just, that all felt very natural. And then his relationship between Thad and his wife, I really enjoyed that because that felt like a real relationship. It didn't feel like, oh, we're spending time with his wife now. Oh, he's got kids or something. No, it felt like a lived in like family. So I really enjoyed how fleshed out it felt pretty early on, even before you bring in some of the strangeness and stuff.
Yeah, I think the development of the characters is what really helps bolster the story, even with
Mm-hmm.
how weird it is, because at first you're like, okay, there is this guy going around killing people seemingly at random. And we do eventually get more to that story, but it takes its time to develop.
Mm-hmm.
We spend a lot of time, going back and forth with Alan and Thad, and they're kind of, playing this cat and mouse game. But at the same time, there are so many things that are inexplicable to Alan. He's like, okay, you clearly have an alibi. You had this party and people were here until, 1 in the morning or whatever the time was, but
Mm-hmm.
people were there well into the night to where Thad couldn't have possibly disappeared without people noticing.
Yeah, because he had to have like traveled like at the very least like an hour or more to get to wherever the murder was, and then it turned out that at least the a certain point that they were able to absolutely confirm that a bunch of people were still at the party, the
Hmm.
murder was already being committed at that time. So even if he left and went and did the murder, like the timeline did not match up with what the coroner was able to give.
And the thing that helped with his alibi was the fact that one of the guests didn't particularly care for Thad and still
Mm-hmm.
alibied him out. So it's one of those things where, okay, if it's your wife or your family, they're not
Yeah.
going to say that is a super concrete alibi because your family is more likely to lie
Yeah.
for you.
And he calls that out too.
Yeah, exactly. So he's not afraid to be like, hey, I can't explain this and you can't explain it, but I know where I was when this
Mm-hmm.
happened. So there has to be some other explanation. And Thad is equally as invested in figuring out what really happened as Alan is because he's the one being accused. And,
Yeah.
he has his wife, he has 2 kids. And while we don't see too terribly much of the kids, they give us just enough for us to sort of get what their personalities are like,
Yeah.
especially later on when they are taken by George.
Yeah. They gave us enough so that later when they're taken, not that we wouldn't necessarily care that, the children were taken at, to begin with, but we felt like we had a relationship with these characters so that there was an added emotional urgency to it that it's like, oh man, like they're in peril. And, even though it's like, even though you never think, oh, well, I'm sure, like when you're watching a movie or reading a book, you're like, they're not going to kill the kids. They're not going to kill the kids. But there's always been like those every once in a while books or every once in a while movies where they do go that next step. So that
Yeah.
sits in the back of your mind and you're just kind of like, George Stark is a bad dude. So I'm a little nervous right now. Even though he says like, oh, I would never hurt the kids. I'm like, I don't know if I trust you.
And Stephen King definitely is not beyond killing off a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have seen that happen. And I'm actually going to bring that up later when we talk a little more about the ending. But you have these intense moments throughout. And even when you maybe feel like you're spending a lot of time just with Thad, Liz, and Alan talking to each other, there's a purpose behind every conversation that they have. It's
Definitely.
not them just sort of talking about their lives in general. They're honestly trying to figure this out. And it's frustrating for all of them in different regards because you have Thad, who is equally as curious as Alan, like I said. And then you have Liz, who is like, okay, I don't want this to ruin our family. And then Thad is like, okay, I know who George is going after now. You end up getting this pattern, and you know that it has to do with the death photo shoot, basically,
Yeah.
that they had for George Stark because Thad didn't want to particularly write as George Stark anymore because he didn't like who he was becoming, and Liz didn't like who he was becoming when he was writing under the pen name. So they go to the cemetery, make this fake headstone for George Stark, and do a photo shoot. And he is going after everyone who had a hand in that happening, basically. So that's not even the twist, though, either.
No.
The
Yeah.
twist comes later when you find out from a doctor that Thad actually is a twin. And while that doesn't explain the DNA and everything being exactly the same, because that's still not the case with twins, their fingerprints are going to
Mm-hmm.
be different, I believe, even if
Yeah.
they are identical.
Which they call that out because Pangorn starts talking to him about twins and stuff, and Thad says, he's like, well, yes, I mean, there could be identical twins, but even identical twins would not have the same fingerprints.
Right.
Yeah, it's the build up towards that reveal. One of my absolute favorite moments in the book is when Pangorn says to him when he's leaving. I forget which time that he's leaving, but he turns and he's like, oh, just one more thing. And then there's a little mention of Columbo, and that Columbo would always turn around and he's like, oh, here's the one thing that I have that is all the evidence that puts you away.
Yeah.
But he just turns and he brings up what is the line? The sparrows are flying again, I think. And he says, does that mean anything to you? And of course, Dad kind of like hesitates and he's like, nope, doesn't mean anything. And his wife recognizes the hesitation.
Yeah.
And so she knows something's up. And I love that with that exchange, and we find out that when he goes up to his typewriter, before, like right before Pangborn had shown up, that was a sentence that he typed on his typewriter.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, then you start getting this feeling of, well, is it kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde thing where he's flipping a switch and doesn't know exactly where he is, but then that still doesn't account for his alibis. Like
Right.
it starts to give you this next thing that you're like, all right, I know for sure this is somehow personally and mentally connected to him, but that still doesn't add up with these other things. So it's like that perfect bit of key information that's just like, oh, okay, where's this going? Because and from that moment, I mean, I was like following along and everything, and I'm like, this is really interesting. It's really interesting. But that moment for me was a big turning point where I was like, I don't think I can stop reading this book until I finish it. I need to see where this
Yeah.
goes.
And when Alan gets a hold of the doctor who operated on Thad when he was a boy, he is able to get all of this information, and we get all of the same information because it seems like Thad didn't really know or understand what had happened during that operation because he was
Mm-hmm.
so young. So when the doctor lays it all out and the fact that he consumed a twin and there were, certain parts of the twin that they had to take out, like an eye and, some other pieces, which is a bizarre thing to read
And
about.
yeah,
But
it's like it's details like that it's like if I had to explain this book to someone without reading it, I feel like they would just like be like, no. Like, no, I'm
yeah.
not, like, that sounds stupid. I'm not reading it. But in the book it makes sense, like when it all
Yeah.
comes together, and it's definitely weird.
Yeah, I think that twist works though, because up until that point, you're like, okay, well, does he have a split personality? But how
Mm-hmm.
would that work? Because, like we've said, he was alibied out. And it's almost like when you're watching or reading the Secret Window short story or novella,
Oh yeah, that's one of my
and
favorites.
he has a split personality. So you're like, okay, that one, well, it's not exactly straightforward. And honestly, I haven't read the story yet. I'm actually going to be getting to that one next because it's in four past
Nice.
midnight. But
I think I'm marked for the movie of that one. It's one of my favorite adaptations.
yeah, it's very good. But I think just from watching that movie, this book felt like it was trying to go in that direction until it
Yeah.
gives us that twist. And then you're like, oh, this is bizarre. And there's still something supernatural about it because obviously this guy can't really exist, but he does.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be something like because they started mentioning, they mentioned like a tumor kind of like
Yeah.
they and so I thought it was going to be something with that it's like a tumor's growing back, and that's where I thought, oh, maybe it's like something with that is switching off his brain as Thad and making him George Stark. And so that's where it's like I was like, okay, well that would make sense. Like he's having these nightmares and stuff, so they're kind of like these connected memories that he obviously experienced, but when his brain of Thad was turned off. Like these are all the things that are playing through my head as I'm trying to figure it out. But I completely agree with you. When you actually get like the full twist, like as supernatural and far out as it feels, it feels very acceptable. Like
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that's insane and awesome, and I am fully in. I the twist works surprisingly well for as bizarre as it is.
And I think it has to be that bizarre in order for it to work too, because
Yeah.
otherwise you're just like, okay, well, it can't be split personality. We've already determined that. So what could it be? And the only way to explain it is to have some sort of Stephen King supernatural. I don't want to say trope because he doesn't do this in the same way that
Mm-hmm.
often, but it's one of those things that he's just so good at that no matter how unbelievable it is, he makes you believe it. And it's almost like George Stark is a figment of Thad's imagination that comes to life.
Yeah.
And it's the worst. It's a nightmare, really.
Definitely. I think the one of the biggest reasons of why such a bizarre twist and supernatural element does feel so valid is because of, as we were talking about, that these characters just feel so natural and real, and he builds them up so that we're invested and care in the regular parts of their existence and lives, so that when you do add this element, they feel like fully formed characters. So it doesn't feel like a punch in the gut or a trope, because the weight of the characters, I think, really holds up this other aspect. And so I think the juxtaposition and the balance of it is quite well done.
The thing with George Stark too is that his revenge is never really earned. It's like, okay, dude,
Mm-hmm.
you were not a real person, but in his mind, he is. So he is just going all out and getting revenge on people. And it's like, okay, well, clearly you're not really dead if you're doing all of this. So what's your problem? And his problem is that he wants Thad to write more George Stark stories. And
Yeah.
there's a stark difference in the stories that he
Nice.
writes and that he writes as George Stark. And, you know, I guess you could say the same with Stephen King and Richard Bachman. There is a bit of a difference, but to me, that difference isn't so drastic like the one portrayed in this novel. So
Yeah.
the fact that it is a commentary, I think that just goes to show what King's own mindset was like when he was writing it as Richard Bachman, because you do get stories from Richard Bachman like Rage and The Running Man, which are pretty different and pretty violent.
Yeah.
So,
The only one I know of Richard Bachman is Running Man.
okay.
As I said, I think before we started recording, like hadn't I hadn't put that together while I was reading the book. And it's funny how it's like he had Richard Bachman and he had Stephen King, and then the fact that, okay, that information was outed basically, and then he wrote this book.
Yeah.
And he has that great way of doing that meta commentary of his own self into his book, but then adding that extra level to it, so that, like you said, like the differences of, Thad to George Stark and Stephen King to Richard Bachman is not as drastic of the separation. But it's just it's just a cool piece of his personal history, that when you look at this book, it really makes me appreciate how he comes up with his stories. That it's like something so simple as just like, oh, he had a pen name, and a lot of writers have had a pen name, but then he just added this extra twist to it, that he's like, well, everyone knows my pen name now, so here's this book about this person who was tired of their pen name and retires that pen name. But that pen name is now like, oh, I don't get any more stories, I'm gonna murder everybody until you write me more stories. Like,
Yeah.
it's like George Stark is just like, George Stark almost feels like he can't exist unless there's another story. If there's not another story, then what purpose does he have? He needs more stories, and it's just real twisted. It's
Yeah, it has this murder mystery vibe, obviously,
yeah.
but it is so much more intense than your typical murder mystery. And more often than not, I would say murder mystery novels are maybe trying to solve one murder, not a
Mm-hmm.
series of them. And the fact that it is then basically the person who created this murderer who is the
Yeah.
one having to figure it out, because otherwise, you know, and this isn't a slight on Alan, but he would have never figured this out on his own, because most of it was stuff he didn't believe. It took a lot of convincing to get him to see things the way that Thad could see them, because he was
Mm-hmm.
much closer to George and he had the perfect description of him. And Alan was kind of like, how do you know all of this? So
Yeah.
just the fact that Stephen King was able to weave this story in a way that kept it interesting, and it kept this tension between Thad and Alan for most of the book too. And you have these moments where you can tell Alan is trying so hard to understand, but he's like, the cop in me cannot handle this right now. It needs to soak in, basically. So
Yeah.
you have that tension between those two characters. And eventually Alan gives in and is like, okay, I know it's not you, but I need your help figuring this out. So he almost gives in a way that he probably doesn't want to as a cop, just because of how bizarre the situation is. And it gets even more bizarre before the whole thing wraps up. So is there anything else you want to talk about before we talk about the ending specifically with all the sparrows and everything?
No, I all the points that I was going to build on from that go right into the ending. So perfect timing.
Yeah, so you mentioned the comment about the sparrows
Yeah.
earlier on that Alan mentioned when he was leaving one of the many times he left the Beaumont household. And you have all of these sparrows coming and they're basically going straight to George. And there's this back and forth between Thad and George throughout the book. And Thad keeps asking him if he hears the birds. So when George is like, dude, you're crazy. I don't know what you're talking about. Thad knows
Hmm.
that he has a leg up on George because
Right.
George has no idea about the birds. And, sparrows are not the most intimidating birds by any means.
Hmm.
So just the fact that it's sparrows, but the massive amount of them makes it not necessarily terrifying, but you're just like, what the heck is going on here?
Yeah.
And you get that reaction from Liz. I feel like Alan and Liz sort of act as the audience in this because their reactions are exactly how the rest of us are probably reacting while we're reading this book.
Yeah.
And so they're the rational ones. And you have them dealing with Thad, who, is, I wouldn't say the most eccentric writer out there, but writers kind of tend to be known for being a little different, I guess you could say. I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but writers have their quirks,
Yeah.
is what I'm getting at. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes it's not so great, depending on the writer and the outcome of their career. But you have Thad, who is obsessed now with figuring out how to get rid of George. He figures it out, but he still has this connection to George that he can't entirely let go of. And Liz witnesses that.
Yeah.
And it
It's a
leads
part of him.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, it
Literally.
leads to this tension between the two of them that wasn't there the entire story. Obviously, this put a little bit of strain on them because Liz was like, okay, well, if we're next, what are we going to do? And George ends up taking her and the kids. So then she's put in this horrible situation. And Thad still struggles with getting rid of George in the end, which then puts even more of this tension on their marriage because it kind of reminded me of the end of Cujo, albeit none of the children die, which, so in that regards, it's a better ending. But in Cujo, in the book anyway, the son dies and it just sort of drives the couple apart eventually. They both feel guilty and they can't feel guilty together anymore. And you get that tension at the end of this, even though, the kids are fine. And you could tell that while George was very irrational, he kind of wanted to be part of the family. So he didn't really want to hurt the kids.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That was uh that was a really interesting element to it. And then like as you were saying, like it being so like the between Thad and his wife through most of the book, their relationship was very much she never liked George Stark and she never
Right.
liked the person that Thad was when he wrote as George Stark. But for most of the book, he had retired George Stark, and while she never liked George Stark, the one of the conversations they have is he's his I believe him being like, I didn't either. And he's like, and I'm happy he's gone. I'm happy I'm not writing it as him anymore. And so for most of the book, that's kind of the a joint understanding that they have. Even though there was still clearly some history and tension to that, it was, well, we're on the same page and that's behind us. And here's this future for us. But then when all this stuff starts happening, it's harder for her to be like, he's not really, he's not really gone. Like what's going on with this? It's like, and not knowing the connection between them yet, but knowing because of the creation of this character, this is now affecting our lives. Like whether it's some crazy person who's just obsessed with his writing and trying to pretend to be George Stark or what, this pain in their relationship is now continuing in a physical form. And then it takes that even further step of, oh, it's a physical form, but it's a part of Thad. It's this twin that is now in a physical form. And then, as you mentioned, she then sees when push comes to shove, he's not necessarily quite ready to let George Stark go.
Yeah.
That there is this weird kinship between the two of them, and he kind of in a twisted way likes George Stark.
I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he was sort of enjoying the story that he ended up writing.
Yeah, he's just proud of what he wrote. Yeah.
Yeah, in a way that felt like what happened in Misery, because you have this guy being held captive, which that is in a sense. He's not literally being held captive,
Mm-hmm.
but mentally he sort of is by George Stark, because it's like, if I don't write this book, people are going to die. And George acts on that. He takes his wife and his children and gives Thad this deadline. So he has to come up with something that he knows George will like, which will mean he kind of has to like it too.
Yeah.
So, it has to be good. And the same thing happens with the character Paul in Misery. He is writing for his number one fan, but he is making her let him do it at his own pace. So that's the one difference. He sort of has a little more leverage because he's literally being held captive and she's not also a writer. But with George technically being a writer, because he's the pen name, he knows when it's good and when it isn't. So you have these parallels between commentary on authors from Stephen King.
Yeah.
It's something that's common in more of his books than I thought, honestly. It
Yeah.
it kind of amazes me. I'm like, wow, he had this many stories to write about writers.
Yeah. I really liked the I liked the little details about how he had to Thad had to find he had to find a pencil
Yeah, a
that
specific kind of pencil that he only uses as George Stark.
yeah, like the just tiny little details like that I really enjoyed and were super interesting, and how there was this like connection of how it's like I can see you and you can see me, but then there were blind spots to it and how to get around that. And that's where like a lot of the ending is very much within their heads and, writing a paper. So, it's I'll be interested to watch the movie at some point, but as a book, it really something like that really works because you're getting everything that they're saying out loud, but then you're getting all this excessive information about what's going on in their heads, and how Thad is figuring it out to like outthink him, and you're following along with that, and you become really invested. And in when you're reading it, if you think about like action wise visually in that scene, there's not a ton going on except excessive amount of sparrows and everything,
Right.
but because of the details that we're getting, it feels incredibly action packed when you're reading it. Like
Yeah.
the intensity is revved up, and it's like I was going page by page pretty quickly through that because I was just like, oh man, like this is crazy. I'm like, how are they going to get out of this? And throughout the whole book, we're conditioned to kind of hate George Stark because
Right.
he's evil. He's evil. But then it's like when, as you said, you do get that he wants to be part of the family. You're just kind of like, you don't like him, but Stephen King has that great way of making you feel compassionate about a monster.
Yeah, you almost pity him because he just wants what Thad has. And,
Yeah.
pun intended, the last part of this book flies by.
Yeah. It really really does. Like I had to go back like a couple times when I was going through because I was like, wait, did I miss something? Because it's just I got so into it, and so the last half I think I like reread like a few things a few times because I was really I really really enjoyed this book. Not was I really did. And I didn't like you. I didn't know what to expect when I like kind of checked out the plot.
Yeah.
I think another relationship that's kind of fractured at the end. Not that they were super close, but Pangborn, even though he was like, all right, I know it's not you, and this is all weird, and I understand this and everything. I also particularly enjoyed the scene where Pangborn decides that he's like, all right, I'm gonna go in myself because if this goes south, I can live with that.
Yeah.
But if
He's not going to put others in danger.
yeah. And I really, really enjoyed that scene. But even at the end, like between Thad and Pangborn, like it's kind of like you definitely get the impression like, yeah, we're not going to be hanging out. Like
Yeah.
this
There's
is
just sort
over.
of this mutual respect for
Yeah.
everything that went down. And you get the sense that Alan is like, okay, I need to go sit with this for a bit because this
Mhm.
was crazy and you can stay here.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad that this is resolved. I'm glad it's done, and we worked together. Great. Uh have a
Bye.
good one. Like, yeah. I wish you well on all your endeavors. Like, please
Yeah.
don't create any more insane
Problems.
murderers. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, to wrap this up with some final thoughts, clearly we were pretty much on the same page with this one. And
Yeah.
I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads because I was impressed with how much I ended up liking it. There were still some things here and there where it was like, okay, that's a little too weird, maybe, but
Mhm.
it's Stephen King, so I am willing to forgive quite a few things, especially for a story that was as well paced as this one and really just engrosses you in the story. Like, you can't help but want to keep reading, even though you're like, I should probably go to bed now.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think the only, yeah, like, I mean, it definitely, the stuff gets weird and bizarre, and kind of sometimes at a certain moment you just have to, you kind of set the book down and you kind of take a little step back and you're
Yeah.
like, all right, I just need to comprehend this for a second, and
What just happened?
that's kind of where I got, like, in the ending, where I was so, like, invested in it, but then at the same time it's like he's gonna write George Stark out of existence, like, and it's comprehending, like, how he's doing this. And one of the only things that I think, and I would agree, like, probably, if I were to rate it for what was it, 4.5 out of 5,
Okay.
uh or 4 out of 5, I don't know, but
It's around there.
because I think it, yeah, I think it was very, very good and very well paced. And there was only one piece of the storyline that I probably didn't really care about. And I think it goes to show that the fact that I don't think we even mentioned it is Pangborn's wife. There was this little side thing of, like, her being ill, but
Yeah.
it's just kind of like, we're not really given much with their relationship, and not, maybe we're not supposed to. It's just kind of like a part of his character. But when there was the whole thing of, like, her being ill, I kind of thought maybe there might be a little bit more to that.
And then he's just never home. So you're like, oh, okay, that's weird.
Yeah, my wife's ill. I should get home, but I'll come back out, and it's fine. So it was just kind of like, I think it was just a glimpse into his family life, but it didn't really add much to the rest of the story. So that's probably the only time that I was just kind of like, all right, well, that's not really going anywhere. So let's get back to all the weird stuff. But
Yeah.
overall, I thought it was really good. I would definitely, well, I mean, hopefully, if you listen to this, you'd already read it. But if not, I think still, even knowing the twist, I think it could be a really fun read. This might be one that I actually go back and reread sometime, because it was a fun quick read. And granted, I also have a major backlog of books, so I probably shouldn't reread things.
Yeah. Yeah, I know how you feel.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for coming on to discuss this one. I have not seen the movie yet, so I'm looking forward to checking that out and sort of having that moment like you did to compare and contrast the
Yeah.
things.
I think it's on Hulu or Prime right now.
Yeah,
I think I saw
I
it
think
just
it
went
keeps
out.
going back and forth between the
Yeah.
two.
Yeah.
Before we go, though, I want to let you all know about our Patreon. There are currently 2 tiers for Chat Cemetery. There's a general support tier for $1 a month, and I just added a new one. If you want a Chat Cemetery sticker, you can get one of those if you sign up for the $2 tier. Another way to support the show is to tell a fellow Stephen King or horror fan about it. You can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at Chat Cemetery. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.